Welcome to my channel, Wholesome Engraving. My name is Francois, and today we will work on my second chessboard. As you can see, I've already started planing the material here. One thing to note, there's a lot of wood chips on the floor because I completely forgot to turn on my dust collection. And I was so focused on setting up the cameras and everything and make sure I got a good view that I didn't really notice all the mess I was making. This project is a commission piece from a friend, so this time it's not just for myself, so I really want it to be well done because someone's gonna use it. Here I'm just trimming the sides so that I have straight edges. I don't have a joiner, so I'm using a table saw with a 4 feet level attached to the fence, which works quite well for me. And this time around, instead of using the laser to cut all the squares, which I've learned was not a great idea, there's a much simpler method, just using the table saw, as everyone is doing actually. You cut boards and then you glue them together, rotate the whole assembly 90 degrees and recut, and then inverse every other pieces. Anyway, you'll see in a second what I'm doing. But yeah, reinventing the wheel with the laser was not my best idea, but sometimes you gotta try things to figure out what works and what doesn't, and that was an interesting experiment for sure. Now what I'm cutting here is walnut, and it's gonna be used for the dark squares, and for the light squares I'm gonna use maple, bird's eye maple to be exact. Here I gotta cut the edge, and once I have a clean straight edge to put against the fence, I'll cut the actual board to the width of the square, which I'm measuring here to make sure it's the same than the dark squares. So I'm running a board here just to make sure I'll get the exact width. In truth, had I been a little smarter, I would have cut my edges first and then set my width for the square once and just use that for everything. However, I didn't think about that at the time, so I had to readjust, which is not easy with that table saw. But in the end, it worked out quite well. Now here's an interesting story. Pay attention in a second to the table saw bed here, bottom middle. You can see some yellow plastic. It's gone now. But yeah, I got that micro jigger push block that I was using for the first time on this project, and I nicked it on the blade, which I don't know if I should feel grateful or upset about because it's the first time using it and I damage it. But then maybe it saved me a finger, or, you know, a board to be thrown at me or something. So it probably played his role. But yeah, I was not too happy to damage it on the first used, or first project anyway. And here I got all my strips or boards, and I'm just gluing them all up together. Some clamping going on. I was lucky the board didn't lift because I didn't put anything on top of them, which in retrospect I should have, but it worked out okay. But usually you want to clamp them vertically as well to make sure it stays level. And once the glue dry, time to remove the clamps. Now that I have one big board with interpolated colors, I guess, is that how you say it? Anyway, the idea is that we're going to flip this 90 degree and cut some strips, and so each strips is going to have a square of alternating color. So my table saw is not great, but I can't really afford a new table saw in terms of space or price. One thing I could do to improve it further, other than that fence thing going on, was to change the blade. In my last video, you saw me using a finishing blade, which a really high tooth count. I don't remember how many, but it was way too much for the purpose of ripping. This time around, I got a 24T CNT blade, which is really affordable, and it really, really improved my cutting on the table saw. It's cutting way smoother, and it doesn't leave burn mark anymore. So yeah, this video is not sponsored by anyone. I mean, I barely have anyone following my channel anyway. But that CNT blade really did a good job and was the biggest improvement I've made to my table saw, I think, so far. Really happy with it. It's cutting smooth like butter, doesn't leave any burn marks. Well, yeah, we just saw some burn marks, but they're mainly my fault for not pushing the wood through well enough for like putting side pressure onto the blade. That's not the blade's fault. And here you can see I reversed every other strip and we got a checker pattern. I'm sorry about my back here. I wasn't really thinking about the filming part anymore. But what I'm doing on the other side is, as you can see now, removing the excess glue. I'll have to sand anyway, but the more I can remove ahead of time, the better I find. I use an old chisel, not a sharp one, for that purpose. And on the side of the table saw, you can see my finishing blade from the previous video. That's really more for a miter saw. I shouldn't have bought that in the first place. Lesson learned. And I'm measuring here the length and width of the board because I want it to be square. And it so happened that one side is a tiny bit larger. I think overall I was 1/8 of an inch larger. And I decided to just shave off a tiny bit off a few square just to get that perfect square once it'll be glued up. But it taught me some thinking about how I would proceed, and that's why I was just looking at the board and thinking about my life, I guess. This here is going to be the backing board onto which I'll glue the strips. I like to use plywood for this because it's straight. However, we'll see later that for some reason, and that happened with the last board as well, it might just be the glue, I'm not sure, but there will be some deflection from the whole assembly, which will appear a little later once everything is glued up and dried for a few days. Yeah, if you see me doing a mistake right now, that could explain why the whole thing is going to be curved. Let me know in the comment. So aside than that problem that's going to show up, the idea here is to glue all the pieces onto a flat board, making sure everything is flat, clamp it all down, and let it dry as a single piece. So that's going to be the game board. I don't know if there's like a technical nomenclature to making chessboards. I'm just making names and terms as I goes, but basically the game board to me is the assembly of the baseboard onto which I glued the squares. And so that's what I'm working on. One thing I've realized doing some woodworking is I'll never have enough clamps. It doesn't matter how many I have. I do a project, I run out of clamps, and I decided to stop filming so you wouldn't know what kind of contraption I did to overcome that issue. But yeah, I go buy some more. Next project comes, again, out of clamps. You can never have enough clamps. Okay, here we're just on to the next day. Everything has dried and I'm trying to sand off the glue residue. It's my first pass of sanding, so it's quite aggressive and really just trying to not even smooth everything out, but just bring everything to the same level, make sure I don't have any gaps, and that all traces of glue is gone. And you can see at this stage the whole game board is flat. The glue dried and it is flat. But despite keeping it indoor in my house, you know, at a reasonable temperature with the humidity level I typically live at, it will curve. It'll take a few days, probably more around a week actually, but there's going to be a significant curve to it, which I don't know how to explain. In the end, it wasn't so much an issue because I'm clamping the game board down onto a frame, and so it just take back its natural flat shape. But I'd rather the game board to stay flat if possible. So yeah, shoot me a comment on your hypotheses, theories, whatever. If you have an idea, let me know. That's one thing that I'm still puzzled about. Back to this table saw here, I like to cut a small bevel on every edge so it makes the insertion into the frame a little more forgiving. Not that I've mastered the perfect frame to board part just yet. There's still a slight gap, which I don't think is an issue, but I find that making those little bevel cut really help. So that's just what I'm doing right now. And if I remember correctly, and that's why there's more than 4 passes going on, I readjusted the blade because I wanted that bevel to come up a little higher. Just high, as high as it could without showing, basically. So I did every cut twice, I think. And here's the result. So there's a slight bevel to it, and it just makes the insertion easier and more forgiving. And now I'm sanding for the purpose of making everything smooth. So a higher grit this time. There's no glue that I'm worried about anymore. I'm really trying to get a good finish, and where I do see small gaps, I fill them with glue and sand over, and the dust from the sanding just fill those gaps and you can't see them at all. Now we're in my kitchen and I'm just washing the board with isopropylic alcohol, and that's the step just before I'll put the finish on it. And for this board I've chosen to try the Rubio monocoat, who's everyone's talking about, so I figured, hey, that's a good opportunity to give that a test. So the board is just drying here, and now I'm applying the Rubio monocoat. It's my first time applying it. I'm not sure how much it needs. I'm not sure how much I have to wipe off. Just really going off what I've seen online. And you can see me using that little simpler bottle they sell. Because again, first time using it, don't know if I'll like it or not. I do like it. It gave a terrific result. However, I had not realized how hard you have to wipe it off. And that gave me some trouble, which I was able to fix with some sanding and a light coat over. But yeah, you really gotta wipe it all off aggressively. And that's the curve I was talking about. What's going on? Why, like a week later, I have that curve going on? I have no idea. It's a big mystery. And it got worse. Like, fast forward a week, it was worse than that.
So I did not realize, but that issue with the curve board was a pretty serious one. I tried to glue it back and just with clamps to put it back into shape, and I was hoping that it would retake its shape. but it didn't do that at all. Sure, I was able to glue it back straight, but a few days later, must have been 3 or 4 days, it was just one evening and I was watching TV and all of a sudden I heard a big crack. And well, I thought it was the house that just moved slightly or something like that. It was like a major sound, like a lot of force, you could tell. And then sure enough, I eventually found out that the chessboard was cracked. And you can kind of see it here, right along this edge. Everything just cracked. And part of the plywood delaminated. I don't know if it will be visible, but here. And so I think what happened is two things. First thing is I didn't think of swapping the boards so that the grain oppose from one row to the other. And so everything was cupping the same way. And the other thing, which I think is the major one, is when I did let it dry, I put it, so once it was sort of like after say 12 hours, the board was okay. And then I didn't want to leave it in my garage because it would get dusty and probably knocked over. So I brought it inside where the temperature was more controlled, because in the winter because I've waited months to shoot this follow-up. So when I did that board, it was the winter, and in the winter my garage is rather cold, so I thought I would bring it inside where the temperature is more controlled. But I left it vertically, like so, on the side, and it so happened that the sun was shining on one side every day, and I believe that it dried faster on one side than the other, and that's what caused the cupping like this. And so those are the two mistakes I think I've done. And when I've noticed that there was no way to salvage it, um, I thought about a bunch of ways I could maybe try to salvage it, but ultimately some of the tiles are cracked across them, such as this one here. And that one. And so there was no clear way for me to salvage it, so I just ripped that board completely from the frame, which was not an easy task. And I was able to salvage at least the frame, and I had to redo the board completely. Um, and that's how I got it done, basically. I was in a rush, however, to deliver that board, so I was not able to film all the follow-up, but it's basically all the same step, except that time I did swap each each board from odd to even, and I made sure to let it dry for longer, flat, and away from the sun. And yeah, the friend who has the board now doesn't have any issue. It didn't crack again. So I think mistakes were made, lessons were learned, and forward we go.
But enough with the game board. We're now doing the frame. And for the frame, right now I'm working to cut out the insert part, the part where the game board will sit onto. And just so it makes sense for everyone, I'm using two long boards, which I'm gonna cut into two pieces each. Now I'm routing the edge of, the frame on my router table that I've made, which is not perfect, but it's cheaper than a router lift, which I wouldn't have anything to mount it on anyway. So yeah, just routing those two very long boards before I'll do the cutting. And that way I avoid the risk of, while routing towards an edge, to have it chip out. So if I cut after it's routed, I'm guaranteed to have a much smoother edge. That was an issue on the last board. I had one edge that chipped out. This time around, none of that happened, just because I followed proper order. And yeah, so here I'm just cutting, making sure the inside measurement are the same as the game board width, so that it'll be as flush as possible. It's still not perfect. I don't know if I'm not good at measuring or what. I still have about a millimeter of gap. It's not perfectly tight. But for the design I'm going for, I'd say it is acceptable. One part that I did not film is how I put the frame together. I basically used dowel pins on each corner and glued everything together with a bunch of clamps, making sure it was flat. That time I did use vertical clamping. But yeah, I didn't film that part, so boom, there you go. It's all done, and I'm there sending. Magic of video editing. So I'm sending both sides because this board, as opposed to the previous one, it's not two-sided, but the underside of it is finished, and it's meant to be viewed and watch and touch and whatever. There's going to be an engraving on the back, so I wanted the back side to look really nice. And I think the trend right now is to do double-sided boards, which I find sort of useless because it's the same board, but you're never going to use two sides at once or need to use one side more than the other. So I'd rather do a nice finish to the back than go with the two-sided concept. And one thing that might be a pet peeve of mine is sharp corners. There's a time and a place for them, but if it's something you're gonna touch and manipulate, I like to put a small rounded profile to it, and that's what I'm doing here. Just putting a small rounded profile. I think it's a 1/4 inch, just so that when you grab the board and manipulate it, it doesn't feel sharp in your hand. It feels comfortable and easy to move and grab and whatever, because the thing is pretty heavy too once it's finished. And yes, I know I'm going both ways with the router. Whatever. On to the laser now. So I'm basically engraving the inlay on top of the frame. So what I do after that is I cut the exact same shape in the wood that I want to inlay, and then I just put it in place and glue it. I find that using the laser instead of a CNC allow me to have a lot finer details, and I can really inlay like script font and really detail things. I'm not sure if a CNC would allow that. I don't have a CNC. And now I'm engraving on the back side, which is a quote from Susan Polgar, which you'll see on the finished product. That one is not inlaid, it's just an engraving. Board or the finishing of the frame, so you will go straight to the final result. Here's what it looked like in the end. The finishing of the frame is also Rubio monocoat. The inlay is made with birchwood, and you can really see the fine details came out well. I'm quite happy with that. I have an inlay on either side of the board, so no matter which side you're playing, you can see that patience and discipline which is a motto that the quote on the back sort of put into context. That's the backing. Have my plate in the middle, and there's a padded backing board, just so that when you grab it, it gives a nice feeling. And here on the back, you have the quote that relates to the patience and disciplines at the front. It's almost hidden. I really like how discreet it turned out. You gotta find it or know it's there. It's like a Easter egg almost. And some pictures of the overall board. For it being my second one, I'm really happy with how it turned out. So yeah, while the last pictures are rolling, thank you for watching, spending some time with me. I hope you got some enjoyment out of this project that I've made and documented. And see you for the next one.